What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through part 2 of my contextualized game log series I'm doing over here at the Fantasy Stock Exchange YouTube channel, where I'm basically just uncovering the truth behind every high pick in fantasy football from their 2021 season and ultimately trying to spot any contextual patterns in their 2021 production. This video is going to be going through every single second round player. If you guys want to check out my video on the first round players, the link will be in the description. But the point of this exercise, the point of these contextualized game logs are to paint a picture as to some extraneous variables that affected each player's stats in 2021, how we should take in these new game logs with said variables taken out, and ultimately how we can project forward with this contextualized output. I want to reiterate again, as I mentioned in last video, but this exercise should be used in conjunction with all the resources you have available. And ultimately, that extraneous variables are going to always be at hand in fantasy football. But if we can make our analysis void them, we can kind of understand on a year-to-year basis what a player's baseline will be prior to those variables being at hand. But again, if you at any point enjoy this video and feel like I provided value, leave a like down below and subscribe. But with that being said, before we get into the second round, as always, let's hit the intro. Okay, so before we go into the 201, I just quickly want to mention that all ADP data from today's video is pulled from Underdog Fantasy. If you guys aren't already signed up, promo code FSC for 100% matchback on first deposit up to $100, as well as full access to our redraft rankings manifesto if, again, you use promo code FSC at first deposit. But I also want to say that all the player cards in today's video will be made available on Patreon, link in the description. But that being said, let's get into 201, and that's going to be Joe Mixon, running back from the Cincinnati Bengals. And you guys can see the player card on the screen, but the context I want to take away from Joe Mixon's 2021 campaign is ultimately how his splits looked. Once we saw that pass game resurgence for the Bengals, ultimately you would have seen last year in the first 4 games, the Bengals attempted 26.75 pass attempts per game in the first 4 games at a 54% neutral game script passing. In weeks 5 on, we saw that number rise to 34.5 passing attempts per game and a 60% neutral game script passing rate in that stretch. So ultimately, how was Joe Mixon's numbers, affected by that? He was the RB7 last year in points per game, 18 PPR points per game. But as we see on the screen, following that week 4, week 5 onward, we saw that number jump to nearly 19.1 PPR points per game on the back of an improvement from 2.25 targets per game in the first 4 games and only 1 touchdown to, as we saw in the back half, 3.25 targets per game and 15 touchdowns in his last 12 games. With the Bengals offense, again, expected to be prominent like we saw last year, like we saw ending last year, I really have no issues making this bet on Joe Mixon, ultimately hoping that, the increased pass game usage can carry throughout the year and he continues that touchdown scoring prowess we saw from him last year. Again, I'm kind of wary because I see some people talking about the fact that, he suddenly got, 65 target upside. He's going to be, a pass game utilization, a pass game weapon. But I am wary that he passes, 55, 60 targets. But I think it could be a similar case to what we saw from Dalvin Cook a couple years ago, where his path isn't in the receiving game, but more so on elite touchdown usage like we saw last year. If he's going to hit 20 plus PPR points per game, it's going to be on the back of a 20 plus touchdown monster season, which is fully in the range of outcomes for a Bengals offense that is looking to improve off of last year. So ultimately, again, I was so off of Joe Mixon last year, but because we have the basis of that Bengals offense being able to carry this moving forward, I have no issues if somebody wants to rank him in, their top 8 running backs, their top 7 running backs or so, because ultimately here he's got insulation to that offense. And as we saw last year, he was a nearly 20 PPR point per game scorer down the stretch. So I like Joe Mixon. I also like these wide receivers. As we'll get into, the first wide receiver in this round is going to be CeeDee Lamb of my beloved Dallas Cowboys. You guys can see the jerseys in the background, but the main thing I want to point out here, the main, split, the context I want to take out of CeeDee Lamb's 2021 campaign was how he performed without one of Amari Cooper or Michael Gallup in the lineup. And the reason I'm doing this is that obviously the recent news this offseason, Amari Cooper being traded to the Cleveland Browns and Michael Gallup after that late season torn ACL, he's expected to miss the first portion of the season. Can Lamb realistically proved that his standing in ADP is validated by his upside for a breakout. Well, you guys can see last year, but on the overall season, he was only at a 14.6 PPR point per game clip and was at a wide receiver 21 PPR point per game area. But we saw in the games that one of those receivers missed, despite only a 21.75 target share, he was super efficient on his targets. Turned 8.1 targets per game into 5.2 receptions, nearly 81 receiving yards, and 0.6 touchdowns per game playing for this offense, ultimately en route to a 17.6 PPR point per game pace, which would have actually ranked as the wide receiver 6 in terms of PPR point per game last year. So ultimately, what I take away from this is that the market is clearly valuing CeeDee Lamb as if the breakout has already happened, as if the breakout is for sure going to happen. But I do think it will. The target share totals are the biggest concern for many Lamb detractors. Anytime you talk on Twitter, anytime you talk in general, people are going to point to the fact that Lamb is not out there commanding, 30% of the targets like a guy like Davante Adams will. My counter, as I kind of said, he's been so damn efficient on his targets. And the case you can make that this passing offense is going to be top 5 in the NFL. And as we kind of mentioned, he's a 22-ish type of target share player last year in this same stretch. But as he enters year 3, are we really ruling out him becoming a 25, 26, 27% target share player as he evolves into that true alpha of the Cowboys offense? I don't think you can. And in general, if he can develop into that type of player, I'm perfectly fine with this round 2 breakout status. Yes, it's baked in, but ultimately here, I think it's going to happen. So I'm more than fine with paying, an early to mid second round pick in 2022 fantasy drafts for CeeDee Lamb. The next player I'm going to be mentioning, the 203 right now on Underdog Fantasy, is going to be DeAndre Swift, running back from the Detroit Lions. And the main context I'm going to pull from his 2021 season is ultimately what his splits looked like prior to the injury in Week 12 Thanksgiving versus the Chicago Bears. And as you guys would have known, if you had DeAndre Swift last year, he was looking like that odd dead zone running back that actually paid off in spades. And we saw last year, he was looking like the next breakout league-winning running back going in the 4th round. Again, if you picked him in the 4th round, you were licking your chops saying, oh my God, I can't believe I stole this guy. But ultimately, as we know, in terms of the overall season, DeAndre Swift suffered a shoulder injury in Week 12 against the Bears that saw him miss the next 4 games and ultimately showed that he was not able to reclaim that, main running back status that we saw in the early portion of the season, largely in part to the injury. Again, he was still able to finish the RB10 PPR points per game, 16.1 PPR points per game. But as we see on the screen, in those healthy games, in the first 11 weeks of the season, we saw this guy turning out 18.35 PPR points per game and RB4 pace across the season on a 72.4% snap share. So for Swift, again, he looked like this next elite league-winning running back. 6.7 targets per game, 97.5 yards from scrimmage per game in those first 10 games. If this offense improves like many expect, I fully expect Swift to chip into that Jamal Williams workload from last year entering his 3rd season and potentially take that next step into a 20-plus PPR point per game scorer this oncoming year. We mentioned in our zero running back video, our hero and bimodal running back video, but if you're going to take a running back in the first 2 rounds, you're not going to take a Nick Chubb type. You're not going to take a player that you're taking solely based off filling out your lineup, solely based off having a steady RB1. You're taking one that could potentially win your league. And if DeAndre Swift hits his ceiling, if DeAndre Swift gets to that promising 20-plus PPR point per game threshold, which is fully in the range of outcomes, he is going to pay off in spades at that early to mid second round price tag that he's currently valued at. So he is one of the few running backs in this range that I'm more than fine making that high investment in. Let's go on to the 204 on Underdog Fantasy and Mike Evans, wide receiver from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And for Mike Evans' contextualized game logs, we look at the games he played this past year when one of the other 3 main pieces on the offense, being Chris Godwin, Rob Gronkowski, or Antonio Brown, were not in the lineup. And for the purpose of Evans' contextualized game logs, I broke it down into 2 separate subsets where ultimately you see the subset where only one of them missed, and you see the subset where 2 or more of those wide receivers / offensive weapons missed the matchup. And the sample size, oddly enough, really includes all games apart from week 1 when all the wide receivers / tight ends on the Bucs were healthy, as well as week 15 where Evans got hurt and only played on 23% of the snaps. So you guys can see on the screen, Evans' contextualized game logs are pretty damn impressive. Obviously, in those games where 2 or more missed, produced at a 21.4 PPR point per game clip, wide receiver 2 pace if you pace it across the season. If one of them missed, we saw him produce at a 16.9 PPR point per game clip, wide receiver 10 across a full season. It's odd that he commanded more targets per game and a higher target share in the games where only one missed. But when you quickly realize that this is only a 4-game sample size, and 2 games bringing down these averages in particular, New Orleans week 8 and Washington week 10, were oddly enough 2 of the Bucs' 3 worst offensive outings on the season, where they scored 28 total points in those 2 matchups. Ultimately, the main thing you should kind of take away from this data is that Mike Evans is more than likely to reside in the 17 to 22% target share area this upcoming year for the most part. And his return to fantasy relevance is always going to come on the back of touchdowns and valuable targets rather than dominating that team target share. He's not going to go out there and be a Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, 28, 29, 30% target share player. But as long as he's getting, again, as I mentioned, 17 to 22% of the target share in a Tom Brady high octane offense, I'm more than fine with making that investment in the mid to late second round for a guy like Mike Evans. Let's go on to the 205, and that's going to be Aaron Jones, running back from the Green Bay Packers. And ultimately, Aaron Jones' contextualized game logs involve his splits once A.J. Dillon stepped up in terms of his role in the offense. He went from 20 total opportunities in the team's first 3 games to week 4 on 13.6 opportunities per game. So you guys can see it on the screen. But basically, once we look into these contextualized game logs and Dillon made his presence known, Aaron Jones was affected. Aaron Jones fell from a 15.3 PPR point per game clip or the RB 13 point per game to ultimately a 13.8 PPR point per game clip, the RB 20 for the rest of the season. The worry that I have for Aaron Jones is that with the emergence of A.J. Dillon, we saw Jones' usage go way down tremendously. 15.73 opportunities per game last year, whereas compared to his 2019 and 2020 seasons when he was a legitimate RB1, he was at a 19 and 18.9 clip respectively. And the main elephant in the room, the main caveat we have to pull from this is ultimately that he ceded valuable goal line touches that propped up his value in 2019-20. And you guys can see it on the screen, but basically last year, A.J. Dillon out-touched Aaron Jones inside the 5 and in the red zone. In comparison to his league-winning 2019 campaign, we saw him absolutely dominate in these areas. 44 total red zone rushes and 23 inside the 5 rushes. I don't think that Aaron Jones has the capability to score 10 plus rushing touchdowns like he did in the past. Maybe even 7 or 8 plus rushing touchdowns may be out of the question now with A.J. Dillon's emergence in that area. Ultimately, the payoff for Aaron Jones, if you're going to invest in him in the mid-second round, has to be banking on a huge career outlier in terms of his receiving. And again, people are going to give the spiel about that 7-game sample size of, Jones commanding elite receiving volume, yada, yada, yada. He scored like fucking 0.8 touchdowns per game in that stretch. But the problem that I have is the lack of red zone usage last season indicates to me that if he doesn't have a 100-plus target season, which, again, he hasn't had over 70 in a season throughout his career as a 27-year-old running back, he's not going to be able to pay off at opportunity cost. So he is one of the more risky picks. Again, people are going to talk about him being safe, but you're not drafting safe as in he's going to finish as the RB11. You're drafting safe as in, he can realistically get 20 plus PPR points per game, which I don't see in the range of outcomes for Aaron Jones this year, unless, he just has a huge career outlier in the receiving game, which, as I kind of mentioned, I don't really expect. So Aaron Jones is one of the few fades on this list in terms of what I can project forward going into 2022. The next player on this list, the next running back, is going to be Saquon Barkley, running back from the New York Giants. And for Saquon Barkley, we look at his usage and output in the 3 games we can deem him as full healthy from 2021. So those 3 games, as I'll kind of get into, were from weeks 2 to 4. In week 1, we saw the Giants fully ease him back in. 48% snap share, only 13 opportunities in that game. But in weeks 2 to 4, we caught a glimpse as to what a fully healthy Barkley could be deployed as. And then ultimately, we lost that type of player in week 5 once Saquon Barkley went down with the ankle injury against the Dallas Cowboys, thus never making him the same for the rest of the season. But in those 3 games that we saw a fully healthy, fully ready to go Barkley, we saw that league-winning potential that he had. Ultimately, 19.63 PPR points per game, RB4 type of pace across a full season, as well as an 86.33% snap share in that stretch. Obviously, again, there are a lot of things going on here, and the sample size is so small. But in that week 2 to 4 stretch, we really care more so about the usage than the efficiency and overall fantasy output. And for Saquon Barkley, he saw 58 opportunities in those 3 games. Again, nearly 20 opportunities per game and commanded 16 targets in that stretch, 5.3 per game, en route to, as I mentioned, 19.63 fantasy PPR points per game. Barkley now enters an offense with a revamped coaching staff and the best offensive line he has ever played behind, and yet goes behind Aaron Jones with all the concerns I kind of outlined that Jones has. Please just go buy the dip. Aaron Jones should not be going above Saquon Barkley. And if that happens in your home league, go out, take the value. Saquon Barkley is going to pay off in a huge way as long as he stays on the field this year, as you can kind of see in the tweet I outlined. 207 this year, Deebo Samuel, wide receiver from the San Francisco 49ers. And ultimately here, the context that I pulled from Deebo's season this past year includes the first half of the season when he was exclusively used as an outside traditional wide receiver, and whether his value came as a pure receiver or solely from the gadget role, like a lot of people want to put the narrative on for Deebo Samuel. With the 49ers drafting of Tyrion Davis-Price, the thought process behind this context is that Deebo Samuel will return to an outside wide receiver role of this team. And as I kind of pointed to, many fans have questions whether the root of Samuel's value is that versatility or whether he could suffice as a true number 1 caliber wide receiver. So ultimately in the season, he was the PPR wide receiver 3, 21.2 PPR points per game in the 16 games he played. He was still able to produce 20.4 PPR points per game in the stretch where he was almost exclusively a wide receiver. So ultimately here, 31.69% target share, 10 targets per game, ultimately producing a pace, as I kind of said, 6.1, 110.3, 0.5 per game in terms of his production. If you were to relay that across a full season, we would have seen 104 receptions, nearly 1,900 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns. Not only is Deebo Samuel an elite offensive weapon, he is a damn good wide receiver, an elite wide receiver. And I get that there are a ton of concerns over Deebo Samuel after that pinnacle season, but I really think that they're largely overblown. Again, the efficiency is probably going to go down. He only had one of the most efficient wide receiver seasons we have ever seen, but that's already really baked into his wide receiver 8 price tag. So ultimately, if I'm able to get Deebo Samuel on a team where I have Christian McCaffrey or Cooper Kupp or Justin Jefferson, and he's going in the back end second round, like I'm taking that value all day, every day, and thanking my league mates for letting me stack those 2 elite difference-making players in my fantasy drafts. Next player I'm going to be talking about is Mark Andrews, tight end from the Baltimore Ravens, currently going at the 208. And his contextualized game logs recount the games he played with Lamar Jackson last year and ultimately how his tight end 1 season looks with Lamar under center. And you guys can see for the full season, tight end 1, 17.7 PPR points per game in the 17 games he played. If you stretch only the games where Lamar Jackson was the starting quarterback, he was still able to produce 15.9 PPR points per game, a tight end 2 pace on a 73.17% snap share. And in each of those games, we saw about 8.3 targets per game, 5.6 receptions per game, 71.1 receiving yards, and 0.5 touchdowns per game. Stretched across the season puts him at a 95 reception, 1,209 receiving yard, and 8 receiving touchdown line on a 22.83% target share. And if anybody's worried about, he produced more points when Lamar wasn't on the field, like, don't. Is it more likely to hurt or strengthen an offense having an elite top 10 level quarterback on the field? We can look at arbitrary splits all we want, but ultimately here, this is one of the extraneous variables we have to take into account that, yeah, he played well when the backup was on the field, but ultimately long term, we know across a full season, we would much rather Lamar Jackson be throwing the football to Mark Andrews because Lamar Jackson is that good of a player. So we're going to go on to the next player. That's going to be Tyreek Hill, wide receiver newly of the Miami Dolphins. And this is the first one of this video where I couldn't really find a contextual pattern to pull from his 2021 season, specifically in relation to what we could expect from him going into 2022. Obviously, again, we know Tyreek Hill is one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, should still continue that standing, but there's no real pattern I could pull here other than a couple games that, the Chiefs were up late and pulled them, but that's a really arbitrary split to be able to pull going into next season. Next player we're going to be talking about at the 210 is going to be Javonte Williams, running back from the Denver Broncos, and ultimately how Javonte Williams performed post rookie buy bump, a term coined by Hayden Winks of Underdog Fantasy. So how does this oncoming second-year running back really measure up after the Broncos week 11 bye week? And you guys can see it on the screen with the player card. RB 26 PPR points per game, 12.1 per game in the full season. Those numbers actually rose to 14.99 PPR points per game, RB15 from week 11 on. And the main thing I want to pull here is that he was a damn near 15 PPR point per game back this stretch, despite only a 57.43% snap share. Again, we expect this to be a timeshare, of course. Melvin Gordon is there. He's not going to go away. Javonte Williams isn't suddenly going to be a bell cow, but with this offense expected to be much improved, and Javonte as a rookie still being able to command 17.7 opportunities per game down this stretch, I genuinely feel like we're drafting Javonte Williams at his floor right now. And if he sees that typical year 1 to 2 bump, he presents league-winning upside. You guys can see the typical year 1 to 2 bump being a added 8.3% opportunity share, 1.8 weighted opportunities per game, 1.4 attempts per game, etc. There, tweeted out by FF Spaceman. So ultimately, if we see that come to fruition with Javonte Williams, these projection bros who are so focused on, you know, what this split's going to be, ultimately going to look foolish because of the upside case that Javonte Williams represents. Late second round, you can get him on a team with Christian McCaffrey all day, every day. 211, T. Higgins, wide receiver from Cincinnati Bengals. And realistically, when I went through and tried to find, you know, contextual statistical patterns from this season, there wasn't really much that stood out. The only thing I will point to was about the midpoint of the season where he had a stretch of about, you know, 5 or 6 games or so where he did not score a touchdown. And realistically, that's just variance. That's just expecting, you know, on a seasonal basis, if he gets, you know, 6 to 10 touchdowns, 6 to 11 touchdowns, he's going to have a stretch where he doesn't score a touchdown in 4, 5, 6 games, which will happen and affect every single wide receiver. So ultimately here, in terms of his actual contextualized game logs, there's not much I can pull to aside from the fact that this is going to happen to every single wide receiver. The next and final player of the second round on Underdog Fantasy is going to be Leonard Fournette, running back from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going at the 212. And the purpose of Leonard Fournette's contextualized game logs is going to look at the splits once he was able to claim that status as Tampa Bay's pure bell cow running back, like we saw from week 4 onward. And does Leonard Fournette look like a league-winning running back down the stretch when we only scoped into his run once he finally usurped Ronald Jones as the main RB1 of this backfield? Well, you guys can see overall season was obviously fantastic. RB4, 18.2 PPR points per game in the 14 games he played. But he took a next step in that New England game onwards once he was able to become the full bell cow. The answer is a clear yes. Leonard Fournette was a legitimate stud this past year to the tune of nearly 21 opportunities per game, 6.3 targets per game, and a touchdown per game in the stretch that he was deemed as the bell cow running back for ultimately what was one of the best offenses in the NFL. And at his current ADP, all of the risks, the weight concerns, you know, the Twitter picks, everything people want to blow up are ultimately baked in. And he has the upside to potentially be another top 5 running back yet again this season. I mentioned it with Javonte. I mentioned it with a lot of players in this range, but realistically, the second round is such a flat area that if you pick at the early portion of the first round this year and you can wrap around, get a stud like Leonard Fournette, a stud like, you know, T. Higgins, a stud like Mark Andrews, etc., to pair with a guy like Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, you are going to be at such an advantageous spot in your fantasy leagues in relation to the rest of your league mates. But ultimately here, if you guys made it this far in the video, at the end of this video and enjoyed, I mentioned at the beginning, but leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel. We're currently so close to 12,000 subscribers. Ultimately, if you guys can get us over the top, would appreciate you guys much. And again, as always, all ADP data from today's video is going to be pulled from Underdog Fantasy. Promo code FSC on first deposit, 100% match back up to $100. And as we've mentioned as we've mentioned in previous videos, full access to our redraft rankings manifesto to get you guys ready for your fantasy drafts. Again, August is coming upon us. September is coming upon us. Football is coming back. Training camp's right around the corner. So if you guys want to get ahead, get access to our full rankings over here at FSC, go do so. But either way, appreciate you guys for making this far and enjoy your week.